So you've created your awesome new Roblox game and players are going to love it. They have tons of maps to choose from, but there's no way of indicating which one they want to play. In your infinite wisdom, you decide to add a voting system. With just a couple of lines of code and your super dev powers, you've created a new voting system for your game. Well, okay, maybe more than just a couple of lines, but let's get started. We're going to start by creating a vote manager, which is going to be a module script. Name it up here. And the first thing we're going to want to do is get some voting options down to our client. Now, there's a couple of ways that we could do this, but I'm going to show you the way that I chose to do it. So I start off by creating a show voting options function, and in here I pass in the player and the event name. And the reason I do this is every time a player gets added, we're going to call the show voting options so they can get to see what areas they want to vote on. Then the next step is want to make sure that the event name always has a value. So what we're saying here is the event name is equal to the event name if it has a value, but if it doesn't have a value, the event name is going to be called voting started. Now, for us to get values down to our client, we're going to need to have a remote event, and this remote event is going to live in replicated storage, and we'll call this voted area remote event. So at the top of our script, we're going to need to get a reference to replicated storage, and now we've got access to replicated storage. What I'm going to do is create a function. This is just going to be called send message, and it's going to accept a player, an event type, and some data. We're going to call the voted area remote event. We're going to fire the client, so it's going to send a message down to the client, and we're going to pass in the player that we want it to be sent to. We're going to pass in the event type, which is going to be voting started or whatever event we want to use, and then we're going to pass in any other additional data. And in the case of show voting options, the additional data that we're going to be passing in is a bunch of areas. Now, we haven't created these areas yet, and in here we pass it as a table with a property of areas, and in here you can see we've got a yellow squiggly underneath, don't really know what to call it, which I need to set in this class. Like in the previous video, this tutorial has come off the back of a game that I've previously made, so the name for these areas seems a little bit weird, but it gets the point across and it helps you learn how to create a voting system for your game. So in this areas table, we're going to have 3 different areas that the user can choose from. Each one's going to have an ID, a name, and an image path. They're also going to have a location which is going to define where the spawn point for each one of these areas is going to be. Now you can see here that I've got some teleport parts, a bay part, village part, and hill part, which is in workspace, under lobby, coming here by teleport parts. So the map I'm using today has been created by Dev. It's a brilliant map. I really like the look of it. But you can see here, we've got our parts, which we're going to use our teleport points, and they're referenced here. Now they're going to be used once the voting's taken place, and we can say maybe the users have chosen Bay, then we'll just grab the location and send all the players over to that particular location. But before we do that, we need to make sure that our messages are getting sent down to the client, and the way we can do that is coming over to Starter GUI, create a new local script. I'm going to rename this. Take what's there, we'll delete it. Next, let's get a reference to local storage, so then we can reference our voted area remote event. And now we've got that, we can call the event, call the on-client event property, and connect to that and pass in our on-game changed event function. First, we need to make that. Now in here, we're passing the event and some data, which we expect to receive. And I'm just going to call print, and this time I'm going to pass in the event. We've got our vote manager, and show voting options has been created. But because this is a module script, it's not going to be run. So we'll get a server script, and in here, I'm going to reference the voting manager by requiring it at the top of my script. Then I'm going to use get service to get the player's service, connect to the player added event, Now this always gives us the player that's being added. So what we can do from here is call the vote manager and call the show voting options functionality. So this will come into show voting options, which is here. This will call the fire client, passing in the player, voting started, and our list of areas. So if I press play on this, look at the output, and vote manager is not a valid member of the player GUI. Which makes sense because I've put it in the completely wrong place. So let's drag that up to server script service. We'll try again. And if we look in the output, we can see voting started. So I can now delete that and I can add a new lobby screen GUI. We won't see anything on here at the moment, but in here there's the top frame. And we have an area selection frame. And inside there, we've got a template. Now this template is going to define how our voting options are going to look. The template has some rounded corners, has a text label for the area name, and it has an image button so that the user can click on it, and we can also show an image in here. Now what I'll do is I'll drag this script inside top frame, and let's update the script so we can start showing these voting options. Now the first thing that's going to get passed down is voting started, so we're going to handle that event. Now when the voting does start, we want to create our voting options. So I've added a create area selection options, which accepts all the areas. So in here we can call this, and we can add the necessary functionality that we need for it. Now, something I didn't mention is that my area selection frame visible property is set to false. So there's going to be a number of times when I reference this top frame. I'm going to refer to that as parent, and we'll stick that at the top of this script. And the first thing I want to do in our create area selection options is reference that parent, find the area selection script, then set visible to true. So now anything that's in here can be visible. So we've got this template that's also visible is set to false. And we're never going to want to set that to true because using this template, we're going to create as many voting options as is provided from here. So in this case, we've got 3 different voting options. So 3 different buttons are going to be created for the user to vote on. Let me just stop this. I didn't realize I still had it running. So we get a list of areas passed in. So what I want to do, I know that's going to be a list, and I'm going to iterate over that. The first thing inside this loop I'm going to do is get the template from the area selection frame. And stopping the game has caused me to lose those changes. So let me just grab them and I'll put them in here. And then what I'll do is pull the area selection script back into here. So now inside of this frame, we have a clone of this template, and we're going to set the ID to whatever the ID of our current area is. So we can see up here, this case it'll be Beer, Village or Hills. Then inside our template clone, we have a thing called area name, which is a text label ultimately. Then we assign the area name to that. In addition to that, we have a text label stroke, where I assign the area name to that as well. The bottom right of the button will have the number of votes that have taken place on this. So we initially set that to 0, and each of our images has an image ID. So I've called that as image path because it seems to make more logic to me rather than image ID, but it's the same thing. So I've set that. Then next we take the template clone and we parent that to the area selection frame. So for each one of these iterations, a new frame is going to get added into here. Then we'll take this template clone, which is currently not visible, and make it visible. So if we run this now, you can see here's our image, here's our text, and here's our text counter. But if I click on them, nothing really happens. But we can see it's working nicely. I'm just double checking I've stopped it this time. Now what I want to do is enable some voting functionality. So we're going to create a voting function, or rather a voted function. And in here, we're gonna pass in the ID. The ID is the name of the area, like I mentioned earlier. We want to loop over each item in the area selection frame, and we do it by called and we do that by called get children. And we say if the area name is equal to the ID that's been passed in to this function, then we're going to get the text that's associated with that frame and increase it by 1. This voted functionality will be called down here, and we'll see that in a minute. Now we know when you vote for something in a game, you don't just vote and sit and wait. You then may change your mind. You may change your mind again. You may get impatient. You may spam the same button. So to stop people just continuing to increase the number that they're voting against, we'll track a last voted area ID and we'll start that off as nil. Remember, this is a client script, so this can be manipulated by the user. So we're not going to fully trust this. This is purely for display purposes to give a better user experience for those players who are just trying to play a game properly. So then what we're saying here, if the last voted area ID is equal to the ID that's being passed in, then we're going to take that value away. Then we update the last voted area ID so we can keep track of it. And finally, we're going to call the voted area remote event. And this is going to send up our player, the vote updated event name, and the ID of what they voted for. So you can see here, I haven't added the player, but that's added by Roblox when we pick it up on server side. Now, just thinking about how a player could spam the button and this would increase and decrease, and then it'd be causing multiple server events to fire. We probably want to avoid that. So at the top of the script, I'm actually going to add a ID to say if it's equal to last voted area ID, then return. Which then means we don't need this. But I'll leave it in as an example. You might want to allow the player to increase the value of what they voted on and then take it away again. I'll leave that up to you. But this voted function is going to do absolutely nothing because we haven't called it. So we can come down here and now we can call the templates clone, the image button in that. When the user clicks on the mouse button, then we're going to connect a function and call the voted function, which we've just created, passing in the ID. So now on our server, we need to create a function that's going to watch for this fire server event. So I'm going to create another script and let's set these apart. Can have this as player added, and now I'm going to leave this as script. In fact, I'm going to change that and call it voted area remote event handler. Now I know at a quick glance what it is. I need to call replicated storage, and we also need to require our vote manager. Now we've got our replicated storage, we can access the remote event, we can hook into the property of the on-server event and connect to that. In doing so, we can pass in our player, event type and ID into the function, and I'll accept that from Roblox, but it got the wrong event type. And I'll pass in the vote updated event. Now in here I've got a vote manager.vote, that's wrong. Let's look in our vote manager and see what we've got. So we show our voting options and we send a message to the client. I'm going to create a new function and we'll call that update votes. And in here, I want to do a check on the player. So I'm going to get the player service. And earlier on, I mentioned when you've got a client script, you can't trust any values that are being passed from it because it's possible that a player could be manipulating it. So what I want to do is check that the player that's being passed is actually here in this game. Then the next thing I want to do is make sure that the vote ID that's being passed exists in this list of areas. Now, if one of them is not true, I don't want my script to continue executing because the only way one of those could not be true is someone's playing around with different values and making calls to my script. So I don't want them to try and break the game for other people. However, if both of them are true, I'm going to want to keep track of what votes have been created. So to do that, I'm going to go to the top of my script, I'm going to add a votes table in here. Then in that votes table, I'm going to assign a key, which is going to be the player's ID, and assign whatever it is that they voted for. This means if a player does choose to spam the button, because the player is genuine and their vote exists in that table, this would succeed. But we won't want them, just because they've spammed the button or sent multiple requests up, to have an unfair advantage on choosing something. So by giving an ID, if they send it 100 times, their vote still only counts once. If they send it for our first option, and then they choose to send it again for their second option, this will just be a different vote ID assigned to their name. So now we've handled the player making the vote and sending the value up to the server. We now need to make sure everyone else knows what the actual vote count is. So to do that, we're going to start off by creating a function which broadcasts the message to all players. And the way we do that is we call replicated storage, the remote event that we put in there, and the firewall clients function. We're passing the event type and the data that we want to send. So now we've got that in place, I'm going to create a function called emit votes. Now what this is going to do, it's going to count the votes that have taken place and then call broadcast event with that votes data. So if I start off by doing this, and then I call broadcast message, passing in votes updated, and pass the data. So what I need to be able to do in this votes data, I need to have an accurate count of each vote that has taken place. But I need to just send down the count for the number of people that have voted for Bay, the number of people that have voted for Village, and the number of people that have voted for Hills. So I do that by creating a counts table, and then I iterate over each one of the votes that have been put in place. And this count table works very similar to the way that the players' votes table works. So we have the count, we have the name, which is the vote, or the area vote, whatever you want to say. And then what we do, we add 1 to it. So if this value doesn't exist in the counts list, then it'll just default to 0. Then finally, we need to return our counts. Then in the emit votes function, I'm going to call count votes, which now means our votes data is going to be what each player has voted for and the count that's associated with that. Now look for the area ID in the votes data, and if that area ID does exist in there, we use that value, otherwise we use 0. Then I emit that message so it goes back down to the client. If we run this, and now click, we'll see Pirate Bay's got 1. If I click it again, nothing happens. If I click Lawless Village, that also has 1. If I click Pirate Hills, that also has 1. So it's not decreasing when I click another one. So let's fix that. So to fix that, we come down here and we're going to need to handle the vote updated event. And that's what we've just put out when we broadcast the message with our updated votes. So in here, I'm going to put in a handle vote updated event and pass in the votes that's been provided, and I can call that here. And what I'm going to want to do in here is iterate through all of the areas that we've added to the selection frame except for the template, and then update the text label for each one. So to do that, I get all of the children that exist in the area selection frame, and then the first check I do is say if the area frame and its name is template, which is what we've got here, then I want to continue. Now what that means is the rest of what happens in this loop won't take place, and we'll just go back to the top of the loop. Now generally I try to avoid loops inside of loops just to try and maximize performance of the game. But you sometimes just can't get away from it. I'm making another loop, and this loop is using the verts that was passed in, and we're saying if the area name is equal to the key of the vert, which was a key value pair, then we're going to update the text with the new vert value. So if 5 people have verted on it, you get a 5 at the bottom, and so on. So if we run this now, say I've got 1, it's still not updating. Let's see if I can work out what the problem is. So the problem with that was I forgot to call the emit verts function. And the purpose of this, as we can see here, is it's sending out the vert updated event, which we'd handled in here. So this time, if we run it, select 1 Pirate Bay, and select 2 Lawless Village, it's still there. No way. Let's say I'll go away, I'll fix that, I'll be right back. I've worked it out, and it would have been a lot more obvious if I'd have had my output tab open. So I'd called vert, and there is no vert functionality. It's update verts. So in here, we can call update verts, and this time call 1, and notice the 1's gone, it's been moved over to here. It's gone from here, and it's moved over to here. If I spam this, nothing else happens. If I spam this, whatever happens, the right value is updated for our character. So now we've got that one out of the way. Let's move on to the next part. So when you've got areas to vote on, you're always going to want to keep the interest up with the users, keep them excited, keep the anticipation there. So you want to have a countdown taking place, or you want some way of saying, right, voting's over now. Whether you show that countdown or not, that's up to you. But what we'll need to do here is create a timer. So after a period of time, the time can count down, and we can then use whatever value has been voted on to move the player to wherever it is they're voted to go to. So in replicated storage, I'm going to add a class which I created. Now this was created in my previous video. So if you want to understand what this is doing, feel free to go and check that previous video. But I'll just leave it on the screen for a couple of seconds so you can pause the video and you can copy this. Now there is a little bit which you can't see, so I'll move it down. You can pause the video again and you can copy this. But like I say, if you want a better understanding, check out the link in the description below and it'll take you to the previous video, which does a whole video on how to create a timer. So we can close this now and we can come back to our vote manager, up to the top, and let's require this timer. And we'll also add a timer instance. So now we've got those, we can scroll down to show voting options. And what we can do is create a new instance of this timer. Now for this particular scenario that we're first going to look at, you probably wouldn't need to assign it to a timer instance. But I'm going to show you something else. Once we've done this, I'm going to show you something else that could be really useful for you. Now in this timer, we're going to call our callback and just print how many seconds left before we have to make our vote. Then what we'll do is call the timer instance start. Then what we want to do after this is get the most voted areas. So I'm going to create a new function called get most voted because there's quite a few things for it to do in here. And the first thing it's going to do is called the count votes functionality that we've previously made. So this is going to get a list of the areas and how many votes that's been assigned to each one. Next, we're going to set a couple of variables, the highest vote and the most voted area, with highest vote being 0 and most voted area being 0. And now we need to loop through our areas. And what we're going to say here is if this area ID appears in the vote counts and the area ID value is higher than the highest vote, then we want to set this area's ID to the highest vote. Now, this does mean that if Bay and Village both got 1 vote each, it would be Bay that wins. That would always get the highest vote, because we're saying if it's whichever first one is the highest vote, then if we come back through with Bay and that has an equal number, it's not going to enter this condition. But you could change the logic if you want to add some more complexity of saying, well, if they've both got the same amount of votes, you might want to do something else. But this will do for us just for now. And now we're setting our most voted area equal to whichever area we're iterating over at this time. And then we want to return our most voted area. So now we've got our most voted area, we now want to be able to move our players to that area. So to do that, I'm going to create a function called move players to area, pass in the area where I want the players to move to, and then I'm just going to iterate over each player in the game and get the humanoid root part of that player, then do a check to make sure I've got a root part. Then I'm going to set the C frame for that player equal to a new C frame, which is equal to the area's location's position. Now, it's also worth noticing that here I am looping through all the players in the game. But you may want to say that, well, only the players that have voted, they're the only ones that I want to move. To do that, you just need to keep a track of which players have voted. And you can do that as part of this vote manager. And then all you'd need to do is iterate over the players who voted, and then you could just move them. So now if I call our move players to area function, we're going to allow our player to vote. We're going to move them. So I can see here we've got 8 seconds left. So if I choose Pirate Hills, when the timer runs out, get to 0, and I've been moved, I'll close that down. So whenever it gets to 0, we're going to get moved. Now, when I've moved, I want to have my value reset, but I also want to have that ability to continue doing our voting. So when we reset it, the timer wants to restart again and we need to do our voting again. So I need to include that functionality here. But once again, it's going to be its own script. So I'm going to create a new local function and we'll call it reset and restart voting. We'll pass in the player because we're also going to emit an event here. So the first 3 things it's going to do, it's going to reset all the votes, then it's going to emit the votes. Now, if you remember, when we emit votes, we're going to call votes updated, and it's going to return all that votes data, and they're all going to be 0. And it's going to reset this timer instance to 0. So it's just resetting everything back to how it was when this module script was first created. And then we call our vote manager and call the show voting options method. We're passing our player and we call voting restarted. So if I collapse the updates votes functionality, you can see the show voting options, and here we're passing in the player, and this time we're passing an event name, which means our event name will be voting restarted. What I'll do this time, I'm going to clear this up. I'm going to leave the console open because it might come in handy. I think this should work, but let's see. So we get a countdown. I've voted for Pirate Bay. It's going to move me there, and then it should reset to 0. It hasn't reset, but I also haven't got any errors. I say that like it's a good thing, but I'm just hoping it's because I haven't called reset and restart voting. Cool. So done my usual trick of creating the function and then not calling it. So we'll give that another try. Call Pirate Bay. We're getting down to a countdown. And we'll see it had moved me to the new place and we're back to 0. I've also got the countdown again. This time I'm not going to click anything. Let's see what happens. I get an error. Okay. So if we go up to here, we see Vote Manager, line 56, attempt to index nil with location. So if we go to line 56, It's trying to move me even when no one's voted. So this is a pretty easy fix. And what we can do here, instead of assuming that someone's voted, we can say if the most voted area doesn't have a value, then we'll call reset and restart voting, which in turn will go to reset functionality, recall this, and it'll just start working again. So this time we'll go to a different one. We'll go over to Pirate Hills. This time I won't click on anything. These locations don't mean anything really to this game, it's just a way of moving around the map. And we can see here that I didn't click on anything and it all just restarted nicely. Now that could be everything, but there are a couple of things I want to cover. One is trigger a voting restarted event, but we never actually handle it in here. Now, everything works fine without it, but you could use it for some logic. It could be teardown logic or changing what events that you're passing out. You could easily change the areas that you want to show by simply creating a destroy area selection options. So if we come up to here and we create destroy area selection options, and in here we'd look at our area selection frame like we have done previously to create them. And then what we want to say is, if it's an area template or a UI list layout, then don't continue executing this loop and just go back to the beginning. But if it's neither of them, we can just call destroy. And because we're destroying all the area selection options, we'll also want to set our last voted area ID equal to 0. So that's reset everything in the UI. And all we need to do is call that, and that wipes out all our area selection options that we've been showing to the player. And then what we can do is do the same as what we've got up here and call create area selection options, and whatever areas have been passed down from our server, then they'll get recreated. Obviously you wouldn't see anything on this UI because there's only 3 area selection options to choose from. That was one thing I wanted to cover. The second thing I wanted to cover before you go is this, that if you don't dispose of these connections when you're finished with them, then you'll start to get memory leaks. The way to handle this and avoid the memory leaks is assign this connection to a variable. And what we're going to do is keep track of all these connections inside the vote connections table. Then prior to this for loop running, we're going to run another for loop. And this is going to iterate over all the vote connections that we've got so far. And then we're going to call disconnect. We then reset our vote connections table, so it's got nothing in it. Then we can happily add more and more connections and not have to worry about it starting to clog up our memory. So we'll do this one last time. If we check on Pirate Bay, we'll head out over there now. Let's open the output to see how long we've got to wait. There we go. And it's all reset. We check on Lawless Village, see if that one works. And in 3, 2, 1, we'll go over to Lawless Village, pop up there. And finally, we have our Pirate Hills. I'm just running around now to give you something else to watch. And here we go. Pirate Hills, we're here. So that's everything for the voting system. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. And I'm Tony from Home Pop Gaming. I'll see you in the next one.